Welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by the Lao China Institute at King's College London. This session today is on the B3W, Build Back Better World versus the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, prospects and limitations, looking at the potential benefits and pitfalls of each one. The webinar today is part of our China Week, which is an inaugural series of events running throughout this week. We have a whole bunch of different in-person, online and hybrid activities. So make sure you have a look at our website and check out some upcoming sessions over the next couple of days. My name is Hannah Bretherton and I am the Impact and Engagement Manager for the Lao China Institute. And I put together this China Week and I hope you're all enjoying the session so far. Today, I just want to run you through the format before I hand over to our panel chair. So our moderator today for this session is Anna Tan, who is a project coordinator and PhD student at the Lao China Institute. When I introduce Anna, Anna will provide an overview of the speakers, and we will go into a couple of different discussions. There are a couple of in-conversation components before we then bring all the speakers together for a whole panel discussion. And we'll also have time for audience Q&A. So make sure you do have your questions ready and pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. All right, I'm now pleased to welcome Anna Tan to take over the chairing of this discussion. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you everyone in the audience for joining us today at the Lao China Institute, and thank you so much for being part of China Week and your participation at all of our events happening so far during this week. So for today's topic, we are looking at Build Back Better World, B3W initiative developed by the G7 leaders, which claims in the G7 summit this year, which claims to provide an equitable and greener alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative that was started several years ago. And the B3W sends a message that the US under President Biden is planning to revitalize its role as a key driver of multilateral cooperation on supporting sustainable economic development. And as part of this, the B3W initiative aims to contribute to $40 trillion worth of infrastructure needed for lower income countries by 2035. But B3W is still fairly scant in detail because it's just roughly just recently conceptualized. The BRI has been there for much longer than the B3W has, obviously. But that is the point of our discussion today. So what exactly can the B3W offer that the BRI could not? And where does green development sit in the heart of power competition between the US and China? And what does this mean for underdeveloped countries in the rest of the world? Excuse me. So I would like to welcome our excellent lineup of speakers today. We've got Eric Solheim, who is a senior advisor at the World Resources Institute, former director of United Nations Development Program, and the Norwegian Minister of Environment and International Development. We've got Professor Meg Rith-Meyer, who is an associate professor at Harvard Business School, which also happens to be our key supporting partner for this particular event. We've got Dr. Guani Lim, who is an assistant professor at the National Graduate Institute of Policy Studies, Japan. And we've got Dr. Zeno Leone, King's own academic, is a lecturer at King's College London, and also an affiliate of the Lao China Institute. So to begin with, I'd like to start off with a question for Eric and Zeno on this idea of the B3W. What can it offer that the BRI cannot, and vice versa? And what are the geopolitical implications of the two initiatives, and how significant are they for China and the US in building soft power? Eric, would you like to start off?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And I think it's very hard to compare because one is a well-existing program with enormous economic power behind it, and the other is at this stage simply an idea. It's not yet clear whether the Western initiative will be more of a photo op at one meeting in the UK, or whether it's a real initiative. Of course, Belt and Road is existing, has contributed to railroads in Africa, to power plants, to roads, to a huge amount of infrastructure in the developing world. While the Western initiative, so far as I'm aware, there is no budget, no secretariat, no business plan, and it's not really clear whether nations like Italy, France, Germany, and indeed Japan are ready to work in any sort of American leadership in countering China. So my view is very simple. It's great if Western powers step up and invest more in developing world. Should be seen as complementary to China rather than a competition. Nothing is better for Africa than if Western powers and China both can provide infrastructure and development. And maybe also West should reflect on where we have our strengths. The United States has not 1 kilometer of high-speed railroad at home in the US, while China has 40,000 kilometers of high-speed railroad. So it's not easy to think that the United States can compete with China and building railroads in the world. Maybe the advantage of the West is rather in issues like education. Still, the vast majority of students in the world want to go to UK or US universities rather than say to the Tsinghua or the prime institutions in China. So maybe a focus on where the West is strong will be better than a focus on where West today is weak, and providing cheap, well-functioning infrastructure in developing world may not be at the edge of Western competence at the moment. Please unmute.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you for your answers to the first two questions. Zeno, what is your take on this?
Thank you, Anna. I think, as it has been alluded, there is a lack of information with regard to the B3W. Unfortunately, we only know what was presented in the communique of the G7 back in June, and in a fact sheet of the White House. I think this is unfortunate because it's quite an ambitious project, as I'd like to say in answering your second question. But with regard to your first question, I think the difference with the BRI is very much about certainty and uncertainty. So based on what we know, the B3W wants to, promises to invest in next generation technologies. That's very key, as we will see in my second answer. It promises to do so with stricter standards compared to the BRI, and that's another very important aspect of these initiatives. I think the uncertainty comes not only because we don't know enough about it, but it also comes from the fact that it seems that it will rely on private capital, which means that then it's difficult to convince businesses to fund initiatives, because there is always a risk. And so there will be a challenge. And also is an initiative that relies on a coalition of countries, right? And so as I will explain to a greater extent later on why this is difficult. On the other hand, the BRI provides much more certainty, not only because it has been able to provide huge investments to its partners, but also because it offers its partners the possibility of dealing with a government where political power is fairly centralized, and so it can deliver on what it promises, even though we know that China has choreographed the BRI very well, often better than the EU with regard to its investments in Southeast Asia or Africa. So we need to take that into account. Also, not always every investment within the BRI comes with a top-down dynamic. On the other hand, I wonder how quickly will it take to the BRI to become green compared to the B3W. So there's also uncertainty on that side. As per your second question with regard to geopolitical implications, I think both initiatives try to shape the liberal international order in a way that it's more convenient to the US or China. They're trying to shape the international regimes of rules. That is the backbone of the liberal order. About the B3W, I think its implications are uncertain, but I'd like to say that the B3W in itself is a geopolitical implication, is a reaction of the United States to the erosion of the liberal international order. And so the way I see it is a sort of liberal international order 2.0, or a sort of more exclusive club where the US might enjoy greater commands over next generation technologies. The geopolitical implication of the BRI instead are already here, and is the fact that it's helping China to draw within its economic sphere of influence many US allies. And this is why back in June at the G7, Biden struggled to convince its allies, US allies, that the B3W should be mostly about China. US partners were looking at it more as a project for rebuilding the economy after COVID. And I think this ties into the crisis of the Western Bloc, of the unity of the Western Bloc, but we can expand on it later on.
Thank you very much, Zeno. To build on to that, this is the B3W especially is an extension of US policy. When we look back at the Obama administration's pivot to Asia policy, it looks like the US is sort of rejuvenating its place in global diplomacy. And I just wanted to ask both Eric and Zeno as well, if we look back at the pivot to Asia policy, a lot of the limitations that it had back then has to do with not understanding the context of the lower income countries and developing countries on the ground. And so what can the US do to not repeat those mistakes?
I think that the most central for the US is to respect the developing world as real agents of their own destiny. I mean, John Bolton, the security advisor of President Trump, asked the African continent, all 56 heads of state, to choose. Either you are with us or you are with China. Not one leader, not one president, one prime minister raised his or her hand, because they all want both. They want to be close at the people-to-people level, political level, economic level, with both China and the US, and they want investment from both the West and China. And if China come to Africa with an open hand, with real investments to Africa, and the United States come to Africa to compete with China, the United States has lost, because it's not welcome. That competition is not welcome. It was welcome from every nation in Africa, and indeed also in Asia. That is a business competition between China and the US, an offer of investment from both sides. That's very, very welcome. But not one developing nation in the world wants to be a playground for a construed American-Chinese competition. And the driving force behind this, unfortunately, is not China, it's the United States. It's the uneasiness of the United States to live with a nation which is at a similar footing. I mean, for 100 years, America was totally dominant in its own hemisphere in America. Then America was totally dominant on the world scene. Now, for the first time, there is a real competitor. And the United States have difficulties changing into that mood. That's very unfortunate, because all the key issues we want to resolve in the 21st century, also every issue which is really there to America, depends on the ability for the United States and China to work together. You can mention them all: climate change, environment degradation, economic recovery, pandemics, even peace in all conflicts in the world. Every single issue depends on having the attitude that the whole world is one family, as is said in the old Indian text. Any idea about decoupling or any new Cold War, anything like that, will be disastrous for both the West and for China, but entire humanity will lose. And it's not like the values are really different or the interests are really different. I mean, the United States also want economic recovery, pandemic response, climate change response, but all this depends on working together. And what all developing nations in the world hate is to be a playground for a big power competition between the United States and America. They want to be respected as real partners by both China and the US, and by extension all other Western nations.
Thank you, Eric. Zeno, is there anything you'd like to add to Eric's points?
Thank you, Anna and Eric. I agree with everything that has been said. Perhaps I can just add that the BRI, the B3W is, it goes beyond the pivot, in my view. It's probably more ambitious than that. And I think there is it's about fixing what in the liberal international order doesn't work anymore for the United States. And it's a sort of positive decoupling. And this idea of decoupling, which became famous with Trump, has actually been there for a while, at least since Obama. And so we see an evolution from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you mentioned the pivot, right? Through the trade war of Donald Trump to the B3W. I would argue that the three projects, the three initiatives were trying to achieve similar aims, imposing standards on other countries, especially on China. But perhaps the B3W is more ambitious because it's more refined than the TPP, which was mostly a regional agreement, a huge regional agreement, but still regional. It's more refined than Trump's trade war because that was a bilateral strategy. So in that sense, it's very ambitious, and there lies the challenge, in my view.
Thank you, Zeno. I think it's Eric and Zeno are absolutely right on the fact that, you know, this is green. The two initiatives, what they share in common is about green development, especially these in the current climate, with China really transforming from a climate laggard to a climate change champion. You know, that I think the BRI has now is now going through sort of reforms to sort of catch up with the B3W in a way that it both are trying to offer green development to lower income countries. But we are now going to zoom in onto the sort of meaty issues about these two projects in particular in context. So I now would like to welcome Meg Rithmeyer and Dr. Guani Lim onto the screen to talk about these issues. So Meg, I want to start it off with you. So what do you think have been some of the challenges facing the BRI project so far in terms of financing and construction on the ground?
Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here. So the BRI is a huge thing. And in fact, many Chinese investments, including those in infrastructure, been part of what has been viewed as the signature of the BRI, began well before the BRI was even declared in 2013. And so when I'm talking about the BRI, I'm really thinking more about Chinese finance projects and Chinese executed projects, whether they happened before 2013 or after. So clearly, some of the key problems really from China's perspective has been the politicization and the speed of the rollout of the BRI. And we sort of have to ask ourselves, what is it? What is the Belt and Road Initiative? And I think many people are surprised to learn that it's not a blueprint. It has no official map. It has no official list of projects that are included, or no official kind of central command structure where people are approving different projects or structuring these different projects and making sure that they're harmonious with some long-term plan. Rather, the BRI is, like a lot of things in China, it's a campaign, which is a kind of umbrella initiative with a broad mandate to build infrastructure around the world, but without this central command mechanism that determines whether a project or any given contract or loan, right, really fits into China's long-term strategic initiative. So what we saw was the kind of, sitting of these projects, especially after the BRI's declaration in 2013, but without the kinds of accountability, transparency, checks on what was going on in terms of what Chinese companies were doing abroad. And so
I do apologize to the audience. I think Meg's camera has frozen for a bit, but we will move on to Guani from this point, and if Meg comes back and she could add some points to Guani's points. So Guani, how green do you think these BRI projects have been so far?
Thank you, Anna, and my fellow panelists. Well, the short answer is that it's actually quite brown. It's nowhere near green. So if you look at energy infrastructure, right, just on energy infrastructure, in Indonesia over the last 15 years, the results are very disappointing in the sense that the Chinese finance energy projects are pretty brown, with coal-fired power plants leading the charge. And of course, there have been some, so-called green projects like hydropower. But do people really believe that hydropower is that green? Because you actually have to displace a lot of people, flora and fauna, so on and so forth. So there's a debate there, right? So in short, we cannot really see the green in this supposedly green belt and road. And to top up on that, you see that many of these coal-fired plant projects in Indonesia, the main contractor are Chinese firms, right? Some of them SOEs, some of them are not SOEs. And they've been financed by Chinese policy banks because China only until 2018 do they have their, what would they call it, the SITCA, their Cooperation Development and Cooperation Agency. Prior to that, they relied mostly on policy banks. And you could even say that, until today, there's quite a big reliance on policy banks. And on the side of the Indonesians, right, they are quite, they are partly involved in this as well because they are the ones who accept these deals, right? If you had offered them the deals, if they really said no to it, then I'm sorry, you can't do much. You cannot push these deals. And that is also tied to the Indonesian, for example, the concern with the balance sheet issue of the government, because they can't take more than 3% of the GDP as part of their debt. And as a result of that, the Indonesian government, at least under the current president, he is quite okay with instead of taking up government sponsored or government guaranteed loans, I'm quite happy. He is quite happy with okay, we can have some mezzanine financing in the sense that you could have loans from the governments of other countries, and we could have loans from other commercial banks, and we could even have equity, which is a form of FDI. So you have this very weird mix of financing. And that's a result of many factors, right? The push side from the Chinese, and there's also the demand side, the pull side from the Indonesians themselves. So, it's, in short, it's not actually very green.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Guani. I want to go back to Meg as well, because Meg's connection has been cut off because there's been a hurricane in Boston. So I apologize to the audience for that, but thank you so much, Meg. I'm really glad that you could join us again. Could you elaborate on your point about the BRI and lacking the command structure
Sure.
on the ground?
Thanks for your patience, and I apologize. Yes, probably not a great illustration of the United States infrastructural capacity. Back to Eric's point about no high-speed rail and troubles with internet, but it is quite a hurricane outside the window, so I apologize. Yeah, so I think many people are just surprised to know that there is no central command structure for the BRI, which means that, like all Chinese policies, it unfolds kind of chaotically, especially in the beginning, as a lot of different firms and banks are trying to kind of pursue their own interests while seeking to pursue the interest of the state. And so what really happened around 2016, 2017 was that people within the National Development and Reform Commission, the NDRC, and at higher levels in Beijing, including really within the banks that were doing a lot of the lending, were surprised at the speed and scale of the lending and investment that had rolled out without necessarily a lot of the political risk procedures that we might think of as standard inside of other kind of international financial institutions or multinational firms. And so this kind of resulted in this recalibration of the Belt and Road that happened around 2017. And another main reason for that was the politicization of these projects. And so I think many in China were quite surprised that, especially in democratic and semi-democratic countries, that the projects had been politicized. And so you start to see people running national campaigns on why are we borrowing so much from China? Why are we allowing the Chinese to invest so much here? And a lot of that was a kind of adverse reaction that was not necessarily predicted by Beijing. And so What we've seen over time, I think, is China become a bit more savvy about how to deal with domestic politics and how to structure projects in terms of the actual structuring of investment. So the switch to much more investment rather than loans. And in both cases, in both kind of debt and investment-based projects, structuring the contracts in ways to deal with political risk, especially around democratic countries and with elections, that they didn't necessarily do first. And so we've seen a lot of learning in the process of that. But the last thing that I'll just say is another key problem, which we have a hard time collecting data about, just like we've had a hard time collecting data about the actual structure of some of the contracts, is the engineering problems in some of the projects. So China is very good at doing things very, very fast and generally pretty well, but there are problems. And we've seen some of that surface with examples of, airports in different parts of Africa. Certainly ports have had some kind of engineering problems. And so interestingly, it's been an opportunity for mostly European firms to come in and do the contracting and do the consulting to fix some of those engineering problems. And so just back to what Zeno and Eric were saying, the more that it's viewed as an us versus them kind of United States versus China thing, the fewer opportunities there are from firms from the United States, although we don't really have those capacities anymore, to insert themselves into some of this and fix some of these problems. I wish it were seen as a more collaborative effort and opportunities for American firms as well as European firms who've been very eager to get in on the game to help ameliorate some of those problems when they surface.
Thank you very much, Meg. That's very comprehensive. And I wanted to build on to what you said about, those concrete limitations those BRI projects have in terms of engineering and transparency and politicization. Do you think that American projects, especially, with the start of this B3W, in a broader perspective, do you think American projects could capitalize these concrete limitations that the BRI has in terms of, helping lower income countries?
Well, I quite agree with Eric's initial comment that the B3W seems more like an idea rather than a plan. But one thing, that and I certainly agree that the comparative advantage of countries like America in terms of what we're offering the developing world these days has to be things like education more than, we're not able to build, we don't have construction firms that are of the caliber that China's are anymore. And so to pretend that we can compete on that level, or, more embarrassingly, to force countries to think they have to choose between the United States and China when it comes to developing their own economies is completely counterproductive. The one thing that the B3W and the West has to offer is transparency, right? So a lot of what's been politicized and politicizable is basically that it's hard for publics, right, in places like Southeast Asia.
Oh, I apologize. I think Meg's connections has turned off again. So hopefully Meg's answer so far suffices in terms of. Oh, Meg, I think you've got cut off again. Oh, you're back now.
I'm so sorry.
It's all right.
The last point is just that that the U.S. can offer transparency more than anything, and Western governments can offer transparency, and that transparent contracts are less likely to be politicized. That's one thing we seem to know. Thanks for the patience. I'm really.
That's all right. So I wanted to ask the whole panel now on the wider implications of the two projects. What sort of impact do you think these large-scale infrastructure projects can have on the global transition away from the fossil fuel and the coal industry? And what sort of political and economic implications can we expect from this global green transition, right? Because we talk about a lot of, going green and sustainable development, but also we're looking the sort of like things that are not as discussed in mainstream discourses in terms of the employment sector within the fossil and coal industry. Meg, I think I'm going to go with you first.
I hope my internet is stable enough for me to comment. I mean, so when Xi Jinping announced that China will no longer finance international coal plants, I think it's unclear right now what that means. And so my original point, which is that the BRI is relatively unstructured. We are seeing a movement right now to give it more central command, so to have more oversight in Beijing over the financing choices and investment choices. And so whether that means that official finance will no longer finance coal plants, or whether it means that China will ban somehow its companies from financing coal plants, we're not sure how much control it has and what that really means. And there are dozens of coal-fired power plant contracts that have already been signed, but ground hasn't been broken on that yet. So we don't know exactly what that will mean. But the one thing that I think is interesting is that we do know that China is very responsive to public opinion in host countries, right? So when there are protests in places like Kenya over coal-fired power plants, right, and what it will mean for the environment there, I think China reacts in certain ways. And so, what that gives me a lot of hope and optimism, although we still think, see places, I mean, Guani, was talking about Indonesia and Pakistan that still have, endemic power deficits in their economies, and they're going to accept these coal-fired power plants, whether, they're kind of part of the global agenda to be green or not. And so an ideal world would see the US and China cooperating on developing clean energy technologies and deploying them to the world. And my hope is that that does not have to be government to government, right? The United States, American firms and Chinese firms and global firms have been cooperating on commercializing technology for generations now. And so as much as the global, power competition cannot get in the way of that technology development, the better off we'll all be. In the long run. So my hope is that we can kind of siphon off or draw a rope around climate cooperation and climate tech cooperation and say, this is a realm that we're going to preserve for cooperation for the whole world's benefit.
Thank you, Meg. Eric, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I believe that President Xi's decision to stop all Chinese construction and financing of coal plants overseas is the most important environment decision made by anyone in 2021. That will have a rippling effect all over the developing world. Added, of course, China will then provide solar and wind and green hydrogen and electric mobility, all the other green technologies. You will see China go big on these green technologies, and you will see, say, Indonesia demand that from China. It's true that Belt and Road up to now has basically been about the brown. It was shifting the last couple of years, but now it will shift in a completely new speed. And President Jokowi and the Indonesian leaders would know that there will be no coal finance from China. Well, what will they do? I mean, obviously they will ask China to provide solar and wind and rail construction. I mean, China is now constructing the railway between Bandung and Jakarta. If that can be taken all the way to Surabaya, will in a heavily populated Java, will of course be an enormous service to Indonesia. I very much agree with Meg that Western companies can help providing more transparency. That can only happen if we work together. If the West and China works together, that will happen. President Xi Jinping has many times said that Belt and Road should be based on the best international standards. And my Chinese friends then ask me, what are the best international standards? And I tend to answer that they will normally be found in the European Union. It's not always, but normally Europe has the highest global standards for the environment, and China could look into that. And that for that reason is also very hopeful that China and EU seems to be working at this stage a lot closer together than China and the US. But the West also need to realize that if the United States decide for a frontal coalition, it's not yet clear who will win. The world as such will lose. But at this stage, I mean, China has 40,000 kilometers of railroad high speed compared to the United States, 0. China was half of all solar investments in the world last year, by far biggest on wind. They have 99% of all electric buses in the world. So if there is a competition rather than cooperation on going green, it's not yet clear that the United States and West will be the winner of that competition. But let's turn everything on its head. Let's work together, because then we can achieve miracles for the world. And there will also be a lot more jobs, both for American and Chinese workers.
Thank you, Eric. Guani, did you have any comments on these questions?
I for some reasons, I think that I'm probably the odd one out, and I'm going to say something that's quite anticlimactic, right? Because we've been focusing a lot on what states should do this, should do that, should not do that. Unfortunately, I think we all know that our works don't work with shoulds, right? They don't always work like that. And if you look at related to this is trade wars, right? Part of this, right, between US, China, B3W versus BRI, right? Is that we kind of analyze a lot of what politicians say, what Mr. Xi said, right? What Mr. Abe said, what Mr. Trump, Mr. Biden say, is that politicians are important people, and what they say or do can balkanize supply chains, including green ones. But oftentimes, we don't really know what impact that's going to cause. It's very unexpected, right? Because it could turn out this way or it could turn out that way. We don't really know. So it's something that we all have to be very aware of. Of course, ESG is great, but we have to be a bit more circumscribed on that. And the other thing about green energy is that, the sun will not always shine, right? And the wind will not always blow. And as a result of that, brown energy would likely be quite important in the near to medium term, right? And we have to accept this, right? So however much we want to be green or pro-green, this is a reality that we have to accept. And transition is oftentimes very, very painful. It doesn't happen overnight. You're looking at, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So, in that sense, I'm pouring cold water over this thing and COP that's happening, right? But that's something that I would like to add, right? That, it has to be a bit more circumscribed.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Guani. Zeno, do you have any additional comments before we open the floor for questions?
Thank you, Anna. So I don't have a specifically scientific knowledge on this specific question that you just asked. So perhaps I'd like to be a little bit more controversial, polemical. And obviously, it's great that we're talking about that. Well, the greening of the BRI, the greening of the B3W. However, I wonder, these 2 frameworks, at the end of the day, they're about growth, economic growth. And so I always ask myself, can we keep a high GDP growth with green policies? I think this will still come with some environmental costs, and I worry whether this will put extra pressure on some specific resources. And I would like to reflect on the geopolitical implication of that later on. Yes. And especially there might be environmental contradictions in the south of the world. There might be social contradictions in the north of the world. So I always wonder whether growth and greening is an oxymoron. And I think it would be interesting to look more closely at the recovery plan of the European Union, because I think from this point of view, it might be at a slightly later stage compared to the BRI and the B3W. So there might be some lessons there. And I always wonder whether, issues like demographic growth, meat farming, fish farming, should be a little bit more on the greening agenda, because we know that they have a great impact, major impact on the environmental crisis, and yet there's little appetite to address these issues. But perhaps it's not surprising, because these are things that we care for, and so it's very difficult to make the first step in that regard.
Thank you, Zeno. I think you've made an excellent point, especially when it comes to the economic implications of green growth, green development. It's still in the very early days, but we're seeing there's enough research showing that China's economy has been contracting ever since they've been starting out on the green initiatives. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the implications of that in the longer run. So we've now opened the floor for Q&A from the audience. So we've got a question from an anonymous attendee to the panel. Does the B3W have a stated goal of being green, and if so, in which sectors? I'm going to take any takers from the panel.
Yeah, I can. As far, I mean, there is no reason whatsoever to doubt that President Biden wants to put the world on a green trajectory, and that he wants this initiative to be green. The problem by answering the question is simply that there is no plan. It's just an idea. There's no budget, no secretariat, no leadership, and again, it's very, very unclear whether nations like Germany and France and Japan, for that matter Italy, who has huge Chinese investments, is in any way ready to work under American leadership in countering China. So at this stage, it's hard to answer the question, but let's hope that substantial money will be put on the table by Western nations for developing world. That would be very, very positive, and it will be much more stronger if it's complementary rather than competitive to China.
Thank you, Eric. We've got a question from Martha. Sorry, Zeno, did you want to comment?
And sorry, I just wanted to add that obviously this is all within the speculative bubble. We don't know, but I'm just trying to guess if B3W means positive decoupling, then I guess you know the emphasis will be in those industrial areas where perhaps the US is still more advanced compared to China. And so that's why the US needs stricter standards, because at least it can protect those industries.
Thank you, Zeno. So we've got a question from Martha. Is the panel optimistic that the US and China will improve cooperation and announce significant climate change actions at COP26?
Can I have a stab at this?
Yes, yeah, go for it, yes.
Right, so I don't think we should assume that they will cooperate only because this is the environmental crisis is a transnational threat, a sort of challenge to, so it's about survival of human beings, right? And if anything, I wonder whether this is becoming just another space for rivalry in the relationship between the US and China. You just need to, and actually, it becomes an opportunity to blame each other about whether they are doing enough, or they are causing the crisis, or they're doing enough to deal with the crisis in front of the international community. We just need to look back at how was the relationship during COVID. It only got worse. Of course, COVID wasn't the cause of a crisis in US-China relations. There are structural reasons for that, but it made it worse. And also I was wondering, how will they, I mean, if we go back to the Cold War, right? It was perhaps relatively easier to determine whether Moscow or Washington were decreasing the number of warheads, for example. Is it probably more difficult to determine whether China is complying with environmental standards, or whether the US is complying with environmental standards? And so that sort of uncertainty will be exploited, I think. And last but not least, I mentioned environmental contradictions earlier on. So there might be greater pressures on certain resources. And so that will inevitably lead to greater competition, geopolitical competition. So we might go back to a sort of scramble for resources as we saw it in the past.
If I can add,
yes.
Can I add to this?
Yes, Eric. Yes, of course.
My view is that not much will happen in Glasgow, but it doesn't matter that much either. I mean, I've been to nearly all climate talks since 2007, and 10 years back, climate talks was really the only show in town. That was where it was the driving force in the global climate fight. That's not the case any longer. Everything has now moved from the diplomats to the business, from diplomats to the political economy. And all the main decisions for 2021 are already made. President Xi's decision to stop overseas coal investment, or his decision that China will plant an area the size of Belgium, greenland area size of Belgium, every year from now to 2030, much more important than anything which can happen in Glasgow. President Biden's plan to the American Congress, which is $3,500 billion American dollars, it will not go through in its exact that form, but if the Democrats can push that forward, again, much more important, also much more important for the developing world than anything happening in Glasgow. Because if America goes big in domestic investment in the green, it will drive down the price. And that's much more important even for Malawi and Madagascar than anything happening in Glasgow. Prime Minister Modi just launched a green hydrogen mission for India. Again, much more important than any decision in Glasgow. And of course, the European taxonomy will drive European investment in a green direction. Again, much more important than any negotiated text in Glasgow. So let's not despair. Basically, nothing will happen in Glasgow, but it's not that dangerous as we believe.
Thank you, Eric. So we've got a suitable question, I think, it's going to be for Guani and Meg in particular. What sort of, we've got a question from David Burr. Forgive me if I didn't pronounce it correctly. What sort of financial instruments will likely be used for the B3W? Which actors, agencies, banks, etc. will be involved?
Does Meg want to go first?
Sure. I think we have no idea. I mean, there's no plan. We have no sense of it. I mean, you know, the interesting thing, I guess there is some new activity in, you know, the IFC and World Bank, and there's the kind of idea that maybe, you know, they should be extending, you know, more financing to the developing world. But basically, I think it's hard to say. We have no idea who will be involved or what the ideas are or the actors that are structuring this. And so I have the same question, David. I wish I could answer it for you.
Okay.
Guani, did you want to comment?
Yes, to add on what Meg mentioned just now is that B3W is composed of several countries, and if we just look at maybe one or two, then the answer would become a bit clearer because it's more narrow. And that also answers David's question in the sense that if you look at Indonesia again, right? If you look at what the Japanese side has financed in energy projects, you very quickly realize that it's always the same few players, right? And the two of them are the public financial agencies, right? The Japan Bank for International Cooperation and the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JBIC and JICA. They've financed some of the green projects, but at the same time, they've also financed quite a lot of coal projects, right? So in a sense, the Japanese have something called the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. But, you know, you can question the quality inside that, you know, it's PQI. You can take that Q outside and, you know, isolate that and really question that in the same way that you could take the green BRI and, you know, remove the green and really look at what green means to you. And, you know, these are, you know, policy banks on one side, right? And then now you have the Sitka and, you know, on the other side, you have the public financial agencies that brings in private sector players, right? And the instruments could be, you know, concessions, export credits, mezzanine financing, which you bring in banks from other countries. So it's actually quite mixed. But the players are, if you really look at them, you kind of know who they are. And again, you know, that makes me feel very pessimistic on the whole thing.
Thank you, Guani. We've got an interesting question for Eric from our audience member, Lisa. Having an insider view of the UN, what needs to change in this institution to give it more teeth and help it drive more urgent global progress in climate change? It seems that despite years of effort, it is struggling to achieve this, and we are running out of time.
The UN needs a major overhaul. It needs deep reforms. It's unfortunately not easy to see that they will happen at the moment. We have had the biggest crisis in the world since the Second World War, and basically the UN has been completely invisible, except for the World Health Organization. No one has noticed the UN in the crisis. So only if there is a leadership in the UN who drives reform and with support from the major countries, meaning the United States, China, and others, Russia and others, only then can UN be fit for the 21st century. There are also obviously structural problems. The fact that a nation like India, which soon will be the most populous nation in the world, is still yet not on the Security Council. while United Kingdom and France are there, is of course not reflecting the 21st century. It's reflecting the situation in the world maybe in 1945, but it's not reflecting the 21st century that the UK and not India is on the Security Council. So there is a need for deep reform, and it will only come with top, very determined leadership. That's, by the way, also why I'm still very doubtful that this G7 initiative will lead anywhere. I was working for many years on development assistance, tried to bring together all the Western donors, and their readiness to come together was very limited. Japan wanted to finance Japanese outreach. Germany wanted to finance German outreach. And only with an extremely determined leadership from the White House, anyone will be able to bring all these nations together under some kind of pooled finances in a real sense. And very soon, I'm afraid, Mr. Biden has his hands full on keeping the United States together. Republicans may very well win the midterm elections next year, and very soon that will be his focus. So I don't really see the US bringing that leadership which is needed, and we need US leadership both to really make any sense of the G7 declaration from the UK, and we need US leadership for sure if the UN should be reformed. So on this, there is a little bit of pessimism. However, on the broader view, I'm very optimistic. I think we'll see a huge shift to the green, led by China and India and the EU, and hopefully also by the US.
Thank you, Eric. We've got a question from an anonymous attendee. What does the panel think of China halting overseas investment in coal, given that it's still heavily reliant on coal domestically?
I take the bit optimistic view on that when China stops overseas investment in coal, it will also reflect back in China. People will ask, well, if we shall not invest in coal in Indonesia or Ethiopia or South Africa, why should we continue to invest that much in coal in China? So I think China will not and cannot go out of coal tomorrow, but we will also see a gradual reduction in the Chinese domestic investments in coal, also because, of course, all the other sectors, wind, solar, hydrogen, hydro, all of them are coming up in a major fashion in China itself. China is now half of all solar investments in the world, so it's big in China.
Just to be a little more pessimistic, I mean, I think the one thing that people have to understand about, am I frozen again?
No. We've got both optimistic and pessimistic speakers.
Right. So I mean, I agree with Eric's comment, and I agree entirely that that there will be some domestic implications of China's commitment not to finance international coal-fired power plants, but we've heard a couple times, and it's true, that the Chinese government does have more centralized power, of course, definitely than the government and most governments that are democratically elected. On the other hand, we shouldn't overestimate, right, the ability of Xi Jinping to make declarations and then to make them happen. And so if you just look at the basic, sorry, it's like coming to the window. If you look at the basic structure of coal-fired power plants ownership in China, it's varied, right? They're invested by private investors, by local states, provincial and municipal governments in China, as well as the central government. Sometimes all three of those actors jointly invested in these projects. So there's a tremendous amount of vested interest in China. And I agree that over time, for sure, we're going to see a phase out of that in China. And I think they're very serious about meeting those goals domestically. But we shouldn't think that, just that a declaration by Xi Jinping will make it happen. The internal politics in China still exist, just like they do everywhere else, and they're important to watch.
Thank you, Meg. So we've got a question. We've got time for just about one more question from Michael Azarkiewicz. Apologize for the pronunciation. So who is likely to meet their net zero target on time, the US in 2050 or China in 2060? Hopefully the MDG scenario, which I think he's referring to the Millennium Development Goals, is not going to repeat, right?
Okay, if I can start since if no one else wants. I am very much in doubt when it comes to the United States, I have to admit. I mean, this is historically the most beautiful of all nations. It had the most fantastic people. The founding fathers, George Washington and the others were making a fantastic nation. But the polarization of the United States now makes everything extremely difficult. Donald Trump got 10% of the votes in San Francisco, 10% of the votes on Manhattan. He got 90% or at least 80% everywhere in the countryside of Kentucky or Oklahoma. So it's a deeply split nation, and that makes everything very difficult. And I cannot agree more with what Meg said. I think that that's very central. What she's pointing to is the need for a fair transition. And that issue is exactly the same in the United States as in China. If you are a coal worker in Kentucky, you may not be happy that even if there are many more jobs in solar, 5 times more jobs in solar, but you may think that my job is going to a solar worker in Arizona or California, because in China, a coal worker in Shanxi, you may not be happy to see Guangdong or Fujian moving extremely fast into the solar or high tech or wind economy. So we need to learn from each other as to how we can make development program for those areas who will have some difficulties, and also cost training programs for the individuals who need to be trained into new jobs in a new economy. And that issue is exactly the same in China and in the US. But China is, of course, more consolidated under an authoritarian government. Our leadership is firmly behind the green shift, while United States at the moment struggle with some kind of national unity. However, of course, US has come over enormous crises in the past. I mean, of course, the Civil War is the biggest, but there have been any number of crises in human history, and America has always been able to come through. So let's hope that will happen also after this horrendous political polarization now. I mean, look to the fact that even the most common sense, like using masks or social distances or taking vaccines, are politicized and polarized issues in the United States. I'm just back from India. Not one Indian politician, not one, is opposing masks or vaccines. All support it, whether communist or Hindu nationalist, whether Congress party or regional parties, all are behind the vaccine drive in India, and of course the same in China. Unless US can handle this polarization, it will have huge difficulties reaching any target, including the net zero. But let's hope and cross our fingers.
Anna, I was just sorry to jump in. I was just wondering, really, not answering the question, but just wondering whether it will matter whether China or the US will have the biggest economy, and I think that will determine also how challenging will it be to get to a green economy and who will get there first. Although I guess the US has an advantage at the moment, but we're really looking 30, 40 years down the line. So I think it's a long time. And I just find interesting the question, because going back to competition between the US and China, I wonder whether, the world allies people will look at who is doing better in that regard. And so again, whether this will become just another soft power tool, essentially.
Thank you, Zeno. Meg and Guani, did you have any comments on any final comments before we finish off this session? Thank you so much to all the speakers speaking for us today on this delightful topic. I mean, we could go on forever talking about the B3W and BRI, and also due to time constraints, we apologize that we couldn't cover all the questions in the Q&A box, but also I just thank the audience for participating today and being part of China Week. And I also thank our primary event supporting partner, Harvard Business School, for partnering us for this event. And our next China Week event will be an in-person screening session of the film Town today at 5:30 p.m. And also we've got other events coming up on Thursday on Green BRI, and more events on Friday as well before we finish off China Week. And thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you see you all again in the next China Week event. Thank you, panel, and goodbye.
Thank you everyone, and good luck for the rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.